They'll find my body in the spring, and all the fights and fuss and anger we endured together will seem silly compared to my death. Tell me about that.
Cory Richards is a renowned photographer,
filmmaker, writer, and mountaineer.
He has worked with National Geographic to explore the most remote corners of the globe.
His achievements include becoming the first American to climb one of the world's 8,000 meters peaks in winter.
And climbing Mount Everest without oxygen. So you got to be a little crazy to go up these mountains and then not to do it with oxygen. That to me is wild. So what was your experience with that?
I believe that Everest, it signifies the finality of the earth. Once I got to the top, I think there was an internal knowing that as I'd gone to the highest point on the planet in the hardest way I could imagine, and what I was searching for was not there. We did the first winter ascent of the 13th highest mountain in the world called Gasherbrum 2 in Pakistan, and it was there that we got caught, my partners and I, in an avalanche. That's that traumatic event that brought all of the other events from my childhood to the surface. And that was really my entree into the world of mental health. As hard as it can be to say this, it became a way to manipulate the world around me to some degree. Because, hey, look, I've got these problems, I'm special, make room for my acting out and my misbehavior because I can't help it.
How are you right now?
2 nights ago,
Cory, you are the author of 2 amazing books, The Color of Everything and your recent release, Bipolar. When somebody picks up one of your books, what do you want them to take from it?
It's, there's so much research around being of service. And ultimately, I think as much as the book, The Color of Everything, the memoir started really being, it was almost just a way to unwind and unravel and understand myself more deeply. What I really hope, and by the end of it, it felt very much like it was becoming an act of service. And what I hope most generally is that people would just feel seen in the complexity of their own lives, their own journeys with mental health, or the journeys of their loved ones. A lot of people have been like, I picked up the book to understand my bipolar brother or sister or mother better, and it ended up making me take a full stock of myself. So that to me is a huge gift. That's what I want. That's really what I want, for people to be seen, validated, and understood in all of it.
Yeah, it's like the core of who we are, right? Like as humans, most of us just want to feel understood and validated and seen. And I think, like, even for me doing this podcast, there's been a therapeutic component of being able to tell my story, right? It's like there's a power in storytelling more than any, and I'm a therapist, and this has been more therapeutic than any therapy session that I've had over the years. But there are some times where I ask myself, like, ooh, I almost didn't say that. And I'm curious for you, what were the moments that you almost left out?
Well, yeah. It's funny because I actually don't remember. There's things about my marriage that that ended in divorce by means of my own infidelity, my own lying, my own deceit, and that it was hard to write that I knew from the onset of my marriage that it was the wrong thing, or it wasn't in alignment with me, but I did it anyway, because that implies a certain degree of, well, not a certain degree, a profound degree of selfishness, that I was willing to engage in that contract, knowing that I was going to break it. Now, I'm not saying that there was a deeply conscious thought or on the front of mind. I think it was more one of those senses that I had, and that doesn't mean that I didn't want to try. It means that I had the sense that it wasn't right. I grappled with it, and I went ahead with it, despite sort of that deep inner knowing in some ways, because I do believe that love and being in love is very much a choice. the chemical reaction, all of that stuff, when people are like, okay, well, you love them, but are you in love? I've actually reframed that to mean that I'm deeply in love, even in the sort of the moments where I don't feel that chemical connection. I've reframed it to basically mean, am I in the container of love? And that is far bigger and far more complicated, and I think far more generative and meaningful when you do make those choices to continue. So that was a really hard one to be like, am I going to say this? Because, I'm worried about my ex-wife. I still feel obviously a deep sense of love for her and pain for the pain I caused. I think also choosing words wisely around our parents, especially when we're writing memoir, is important. And I know mothers specifically feel a tremendous amount of guilt sometimes. And I know my mother does, for all the things that went wrong, even though they really don't have much to do with her. They're based more in the dynamic that grew out of our relationship. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot of little moments that I was like, but I did it because I felt, again, like that could be an act of service. I think a lot of people have that feeling of like, I know I'm supposed to get married to this person, but I might not be right. And again, it's about validating that experience and saying, hey, look, a lot of us do this, and it's while causing pain is not necessarily okay. It's okay to have those complicated feelings.
That's like so perfectly put, because I have been through both of those scenarios, especially being somebody who's a podcaster myself. And, I have my own trauma. I have my own issues that I've spoken very openly and publicly about with my mom and my ex-husband. And I still find myself choosing my words wisely, right?
Yeah.
Because there's a level of not wanting to hurt people and not wanting to make them feel bad for their experiences, even though it made you feel bad. And I think that we all have our trauma throughout our own lenses for different reasons. And one thing I heard you talk about was like that, especially with PTSD, you kind of have this environment of trauma that if it's like just the right ingredients are placed in the right environment, and then you sprinkle a traumatic event on top of it, it's like just the right ingredients for mental health and shit to happen. And I'm curious for you, when people are listening right now, they don't know who you are. What do they need to understand about your childhood to understand the man that I'm talking to now? Give them context.
Yeah. I'll try to be brief. What you said is so interesting, because I think blame, there's so many ways that these words can come out, right? And one can be in the narrative of victimhood. One can be the narrative which is tied to blame, and one can be the narrative of empowerment, and another can be the narrative of these things happen, these are the facts, and now, and this is how it impacted me potentially, and now moving on. And they're all valuable along the way. I think blame is an attempt to offset our pain or find a way to understand it. But ultimately, it's kind of like that. I don't know if it was Buddha or the Dalai Lama, but it's kind of like, being angry at somebody or blaming somebody is like holding a hot ember in your hand with the intention to throw it at them. You only get burned. So backing up to the question, I was born into a marvelous middle-class white household in Utah. And my early childhood was absolutely magical in that, my parents were very, very into the outdoors, and that was our outlet. And that's where they took my brother and I. And so we started skiing when we were, I learned to ski as I learned to walk. So, 2 years old. And I started climbing, rock climbing and mountain climbing when I was very young, about 5 years old. We backpacked all the time. And so you can see that, like, taken just in a snapshot, that was really, really marvelous. I look back at pictures and I'm like, God, how did I miss this for so long, that it was so good? Because then as I shifted into my adolescence, by virtue of, I believe, the way we developed our attachment styles, and in some ways the volatility of my mother, which is very much tied to her own background, And my father's benevolent pacifist nature, there was this dynamic of insecure attachments that developed specifically with me and my brother. And so as much as the childhood was marvelous, there was also this emotional disconnect where both of us felt like we were trying to connect an emotional feedback loop that was somehow not, it wasn't working. And part of it was also just basic sibling rivalry, where we were trying to get the attention that we needed just as kids. So we were battling each other. But what that developed into was a very, very violent and scary and abusive relationship between me and my brother. I was the younger one. And so, and again, I don't want to tell his story. I'll just tell my interpretation of it. I believe that he learned that one way to get the emotional needs met that he had was to act out. And because I was the younger child and there was a split of attention going to me, that I became the target of that. Now, it doesn't mean that it didn't impact the entire family structure. And for a long time, I was like, well, he was the violent one. And we all kind of had that narrative. And then I really, especially as I was writing the book, I'm like, yeah, but is that the whole picture? Because I learned that when he beat me up,
you got the attention.
I got the attention too. So I started contributing to this abusive dynamic. And we see this all the time, but it's very hard for people to take accountability for their contribution. It's very easy, again, to just blame. And I've found that to be short-sighted and not useful. So as we grew into adolescence, we both went to high school early. We were both gifted kids. And seventh grade was, I was in high school and I was getting straight A's. And then as this relationship devolved, he grew up, I grew up, the violence became more profound. And it wasn't so much the physical violence. I mean, it was partly that, but it was really rage that was driving it. And that's what was really, I think, very traumatic to me, is the fear. And so now I had an inescapable stress, which is filling my body with, cortisol and stress hormones. And the volatility at home grew and grew and grew to the point where it was so distractive and so destructive that then I started experiencing anxiety and clinical depression. I was medicated at 12. I was put on SSRIs and my grades just dropped. And then by ninth grade, I had completely basically just abandoned school altogether. And it was at that point that I got put in a psychiatric unit. And then from there, I got put in a long-term inpatient outpatient care facility that, and it was there that I got diagnosed with bipolar. And as we know, bipolar 1, bipolar 2, I always reference bipolar 2, but now it's sort of like with the bipolar spectrum, right? It's a continuum. And so I never experienced total mania, but I did experience incredibly uncomfortable hypomania. And I ran away from the treatment facility 3 times. Finally, my parents said, all right, fine, but you have no place to go. We can't have you at home. And so I entered into this experience of sort of quasi homelessness where I was on the street sometime, I was squatting other times. And, one of the experiences that I almost left out was chapter 8, which is a profoundly impactful sexual experience as I was discovering sexuality, and one that could be interpreted as, rape on some level, statutory rape, sexual abuse from an older person, and one that could be, and on the other hand, it could be interpreted as experimentation and a seeking for a place to belong. But so now I'm in this stage of somewhat, I call it homelessness, but I'm careful with that. And I ended up living with my aunt and uncle in Seattle. I became very, very Christian for a while, as again, a grasping to belong to some place. And it was that time that I re-engaged with climbing, because I think it was a healthy outlet. It was a way for me to understand, and it was a way for me to feel like I belonged in a world that I didn't really feel like I had much of a place to belong to. And it was also that time where I picked up a camera for the first time. And so climbing and photography became these outlets and these ways for me to understand and make sense of what was going on internally, even subconsciously. And that, was almost like a distraction from so much else, even though there was I gravitated towards this environment that was very high stimulus, very high stress, because it's what I knew, but it worked for me. And over about, the course of 10 years from the time I picked up a camera and I started climbing, that's what that became my career. To the point where then I became sponsored because I could climb reasonably well and I could take pictures, which is a valuable skill set for sponsors. And so when I think I was 28 when I went to the Himalaya for the first time, and that started a 10-year Himalayan career. So climbing things like Everest, and we did the first winter ascent of the 13th highest mountain in the world, called Gasherbrum 2 in Pakistan. And it was there that we got caught, my partners and I, two others, got caught in an avalanche on February 4th, 2011. And that's that traumatic event that brought all of the other events from my childhood to the surface and sort of thrust me into an episode of acute PTSD. And so, it's 14 years ago now. And that was really my entree into the world of mental health and really trying to understand it. And it's taken that full time, and I'm still trying to unwind it. I know that was a long answer, but I hope that gives some people some background. So it was, and part of my career was shooting for National Geographic, which was a huge gift, a huge honor. And also just this perpetuation of constant movement, constant stimulation. And so in the PTSD episode, when I had that stimulation, I was reasonably healthy. And when I didn't, that's when I started to take on destructive behaviors like drinking and, hypersexuality, things like that.
So I want to dial it back a little bit. A lot of the things that you were saying is so relatable for me personally. I wasn't diagnosed with bipolar disorder, but the chaotic household and then trying to find like external ways of getting that cortisol. And then it just kind of, a light bulb just went off of me, because I've always thought about, I grew up in a chaotic household for sure with my mom, but food in the house, middle class for the most part. And for some reason I got involved with drugs, hypersexuality, and I always try to figure out those two and two together. But one thing that you said makes sense to me is having that high stress, that high cortisol, there's some familiarity in that, right?
Yeah.
And then when you do a drug, or you're doing ecstasy for the first time, or you're doing something that kind of brings that rush back to you, it feels familiar. And like you, I ended up in a psych hospital. I think I was 15 years old. Hypersexuality, to what I still grapple with, of like, well, was it rape? Because there was a consensualness in it. There was some like, and so I've always kind of grappled with that too. So it's very relatable and still yet a little confusing when I think back at it. I'm curious for you, when you look at being diagnosed with bipolar at such a young age, when you look back at it, what were some of the warning signs for you, and how did that start changing and impacting how you moved through the world? Because I'm assuming that was a big kind of like, what does this mean for me?
Yeah, well, yes, because it's a label, right? And what I was always mercurial. I was always tempestuous. I was always, and very precocious. So you mix those things in together. There's a resistance to, and this was always, there was a resistance to authority. There was an explosiveness to my moods, and so from a very young age. And so there's a question of how much that sort of 0 to 3 development impacted that, and what was going on, what I was reading, what I was absorbing, reading meaning like, taking on in the world. There was, and like everything, like the sexual experiences, that it's complicated because we do offer some level of, or at least I offered some level of consent. And just like that, the narrative of mental health became complicated because on one hand, it gave me some reasonable grasp of understanding of what was going on. And it made it on some level okay, right? It validated it. And then on the other hand, it was a label that carries with it such a strong idea. And we often use the word stigma, but I would say it carries with it such a profound story. And that story is one of, for the most part, brokenness, some fundamental flaw, something's wrong with me. And so I started to take that on. And I also realized, again, on some level, that it made me feel special. And so as hard as it can be to say this, it became a way to manipulate the world around me to some degree. Because, hey, look, I've got these problems. I'm special. Like, make room for my sort of acting out in my misbehavior because I can't help it. And I carried forward with that for a very long time until I was like, oh shit. I'm telling a very, very powerful story about myself, which is I'm broken. And I've been, to some degree, leveraging that to be excused for my own behavior. That if I'm managing this more wisely, I can be making different decisions. But it took a long time for me to sort of be like, oh yeah, this isn't an excuse. This is just a name that gives a container for a set of behaviors, and we call it this. It does not mean brokenness. It does not mean special. It does not mean there's an excuse. It's just a way to understand. And for me, so much of writing The Color of Everything specifically was stepping away from the story of brokenness.
Did you guys know that I'm not only a therapist, but I'm also a coach and a professional tarot reader? Now, it's not exactly me hovering over a crystal ball telling your future. It's a way to connect with your guides on life issues such as career and love and spirituality. And sometimes people need one-on-one coaching to help them through breakups, toxic relationships, healing the mother wound, their spiritual path, or navigating tools as an empath. So I do all of these things to help my clients pursue life and decisions and understand themselves. So if you are interested in one-on-one coaching or a tarot reading, click the link below to get started. Okay, back to the podcast. I love how you say it's just a container of ways for us to understand it, right? It doesn't necessarily define us. And I think that as humans, we like labels because it does kind of help us to make sense of the world. But safe. Then with labels, it's safe. Exactly. But with safety, there comes with stigma. And I always ask, like, it's not about what's right and wrong. Sometimes it's about what's effective. Like, is that working for you? Is that getting your needs met? And that's not always the case. One thing that you said that I want to quote, and you may not remember this because it was one of the podcasts that you were doing. The best way I learned not to go crazy is to go do crazy shit. And in the book, you mentioned using climbing and photography as outlets for your emotions. Did they always feel like healthy coping mechanisms for you, or did they ever turn into ways to avoid confronting your pain?
Well, I think they were both. I think early on, the idea, what I write in the book is, in order to escape madness, I will live madly. I will risk my life in order to save it. Because those environments of hyperstimulation felt familiar, even though there was an actual threat to life, they demanded a certain degree of reductionism that was based around survival. So it was all I had to focus on. The art, I think, was an extension of trying to make sense of it all, but also it was a way to survive. And so I think it was an adaptive behavior or set of behaviors that allowed me some level of safety, even though a lot of it was unsafe. And for a long time, I think it was the best thing in the world for me. I think that adaptation worked. It really worked. And I'm so profoundly grateful for it. And then it started to not work because there's always another mountain to climb. There's always another assignment to go on. And those things, if I found that if I wasn't caring for the internal mountains that I needed to climb, I wasn't trying to climb those. I was trying to get over those hills externally. And ultimately the stress of it all, that hyperstimulation, became damaging. And that internal knowing would no longer be silenced. And so, again, they're both. It's always a yes and.
It kind of reminds me of this scenario of we're always chasing the next best thing. Like we move the goalpost, right? Like, okay, if I get the house, I'm going to be happy. If I get the husband, I'm going to be happy. If I just make X amount of money, I'm going to be happy. And what I've noticed for me is I get the things and I'm like, there's just something there that's not like, there's a void. There's something I'm missing. Okay, I'll get the next thing. Okay, now what? It feels like something's still missing. So it's like constantly chasing the next best thing. So where does that, is there an end? Where's the end goalpost? Or how do you deal with trying to chase the next best thing?
Look, part of it is just purely human. It's what has made us so wildly successful as a species and damaging. But we're designed to chase the next thing and explore and create and continue to expand. It's part of our nature, and it's so beautiful because it leads to so much innovation. It leads to so much discovery. So I think it's important to make room for that reality of our own humanity and celebrate it. What I've noticed is that the seeking often blinds us to the rest of the world. So one, we're extracting ourselves from the totality of things. The other thing is, I think at some point it becomes like trying to, if there is an internal deficit, however that's created or whatever story we're telling to perpetuate it, seeking is kind of like trying to pour water into a cracked vessel. It's always gonna seep out. And not only that, water, erodes. And over time, it's going to make that crack bigger. So we're just going to have to fill it with more and more and more and more. And that can be success, money, whatever it is. It can be drugs. It can be sex, all of it. But until you go into the vessel and start looking at the crack from the interior and or the cracks, and start figuring out, well, what do these cracks need to be sort of patched? And so my vessel can be full with simply what I have. And what shifted for me, I think, was creating a sense of self that was always solid. It doesn't mean I don't want, it doesn't mean I don't hurt. It just means that at every given moment, when I am breathing, when I'm alive, fundamentally, even when I'm under threat, fundamentally, I'm still here. And things are on the most base level. And I'm not saying like people in war zones, everything's okay. I'm just saying on the most base level, things are okay for me, and creating that sense of self where I don't have to fill it up anymore. I heard this beautiful story. I was watching a documentary called Human on YouTube, and oh my God, watch it. It is so powerful. But this guy's telling a story of his grandfather, and he said, talking about the glass being half empty or half full, and his grandfather just says, "What a glass." And that to me is like the reframe. Holy shit, there's a glass to fill up or be empty,
So what were the cracks for you? You mentioned that, for some people you can try to fill it up and fill it up. Those cracks will get bigger and we'll fill those cracks up with something different. When you were trying to get that next best thing, you think 10 years ago, what were you doing to fill those cracks? Where were the voids? What were you doing to fill the voids at the time?
Well, it was climbing and photography and getting that external through those things. I was getting a lot of external validation, which is very easy to conflate with love. Adoration, likes, being on magazine covers, having 1 million followers. Those are fleeting external validations that can never fill you up. And I think for me, the main crack was the belief of a fundamental flaw, the idea that by virtue of that, I was somehow not valuable or as valuable. And I think I could trace that back to childhood, where even though my parents were doing the best they could, and I'm so grateful, there was an idea of not being safe. And the questioning of, well, if I matter, why am I not being protected? Even as they tried to protect both my brother and I to the best of their ability. And I'm so grateful for it. There was this idea, well, I'm not safe, so that I'm not being protected, so I must not matter very much.
Mm. So I want to go back to, you mentioned that you started climbing all of these amazing mountains and you were gracing the cover of magazines. You survived an avalanche in Pakistan. And one thing that really stood out to me in your book was the thoughts while dying. And I want to read it, and I just want to get your perspective in this moment. They'll find my body in the spring when my orange down suit emerges from the melting snow and feathers float from the tears. After months of uncertainty, mom and dad will finally have closure, and all the fights and fuss and anger we endured together will seem silly compared to my death. I wonder if my eyes will be open or closed, and if they will still be blue.
Yeah.
Tell me about that.
Right now I'm reading Sebastian Junger's In My Time of Dying, and I was struck yesterday reading something very similar, where he imagined his death being found on a beach in his wetsuit, his eyes sort of glazed over and his mouth full of sand. And I was so blown away by the parallel. I think there was an understanding in that moment that the struggles that we, and I will say the struggles that largely we create, always seem so inconsequential when that person passes, which is why we lionize them and almost deify them in their passing, because the criticism is no longer useful. We just miss them. But what I think we miss is that we miss them in their entirety. We miss them in their complexity. We don't just miss the good parts. We miss what made them them, and their humanity, their totality. And I remember thinking those thoughts. I remember it all happening so quickly and yet taking forever. And I was shocked at how much can fill the mind in such a short period, and how much true realization of our totality can be understood, at least very briefly. And I've always had this sort of creativity that, and this is partly why I left climbing. It's because rather than focusing on the beauty of it, I was constantly focusing on the fear of it. And I was always, before big climbs, imagining my death. And so I was living those experiences over and over and over again. And so I hear those words, and there's some level of dissociation from them, but there's also a level of just sort of compassion for what I was trying to grapple with, which is, in some ways, how have I behaved, and how has that impacted people, and what pain have I caused, and what joy have I brought? And has any of it had any meaning, or is it all somehow less meaningful? But I think the gift in that moment, the offering, or at least not in that moment, but coming out of it, is to understand that I get to choose what's meaningful. If nothing matters, I get to choose what does, and if nothing matters, then okay, but that's not an excuse to just be a flagrant asshole through life either, but rather to apply the understanding of our finitude to our daily lives and reframe and reshape our lives into vessels of gratitude.
It's so true, because I think that we stress about, we're kind of like bred to stress, right? Like hustle culture, 9 to 5. If you're not working till you die, then that's not the American dream, right? And I think that we as humans, we forget to be mindful of the small things, and then we kind of get caught up in this rat race. And what I'm hearing from you, and I can't even imagine doing the climbs that you have. I mean, I'm a very baby hiker. Like, I've gone to Colorado, I've done I've done Switzerland, I've done like the very beautiful baby hikes. But even in those moments, I have found myself like, I'm very small in this big vastness of the earth, in this big vastness of our galaxy, in the big vastness of the universe. I'm very Scorpio, so I have all these crazy thoughts, but they're so minuscule compared to our existence, and we forget to just exist. And I have to back up, because you climbed Everest, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Like we have to talk about this, because I have watched the documentaries on Everest with the Sherpas. I've seen the dead bodies I mean, there's got to be a level, like, I always think about, there's got to be a level of like, you got to be a little crazy to go up these mountains, and then not to do it with oxygen. That to me is wild. So take me through this. There's got to be a level of fear, right? Of course. So what was your experience with that?
Yeah. And just really briefly, it's so funny. You said you've climbed Everest, and I felt the need, for some reason. This is me. This is how, like, sort of awkwardly and uncomfortably aware I am of myself. I felt the need to assert that I had done it a couple of times, and
That's
immediately
okay.
I'm like, but immediately I'm like, why did I need to say that?
No, I love that. I want to know that, though.
Yeah. It's like,
I think it's great.
What piece of me needs to, again, be validated in that way? It's just interesting.
But you should be validated for that. No. There are some things that I feel like you should be proud of that. That is an accomplishment that, like, so few people have done. A little crazy, but how extraordinary that you were able to do that. So no, you should be proud in that. Validate yourself. I'll validate that.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you. And that's something I still struggle with, is validating myself, and, and really taking in, again, the totality of things and appreciating them. So thank you. Climbing Everest is not the hardest mountain in the world. There are many, many much, much harder climbs. But I believe, and I've spoken about this before, I believe that Everest, because it's the highest point on the planet, it occupies a very specific place in our psyches, because it signifies the finality of the earth. It's the highest we can go. So on a fundamental mythological consciousness level of storytelling, it is the end of the knowable. And so it invites us into, and throughout mythology, it's about trying to touch the realm of the gods. Whether you believe in God or not, that's sort of there's I think, a fundamental truth to that. And so being a climber, for me, Everest, and growing up with sort of Himalayan lore, Everest was always special, and it was always a place I wanted to go. Doing it without oxygen, to me, was a way to really thrust myself against the edges of my own knowing. And can I do this? And in 1978, it was climbed for the first time without oxygen by Reinhold Messner, and I believe Peter Habler. And so there is a knowing that it can be done, but can I do it? And there was also a sadness. I talked about this a little bit with Anderson when we were doing the interview, is that once I got to the top and I was alone, there was nobody else there. I think there was an internal knowing that I had somehow exhausted the adaptation of climbing to try to understand myself, because in some ways I had gone, well, not in some ways, I'd gone to the highest point on the planet in the hardest way I could imagine. And what I was searching for was not there, because I wasn't engaged with what you're talking about, just noticing, noticing those moments. I was still very much seeking. And so it's sort of it's a false summit in a sea of summits that can never fill up that void. But you're right. There's a degree of inherent fear, because you should be scared. You're pushing against the envelope of your mortality in a way that has real consequences. So sports that push that envelope tend to have a deeper meaning for people, in the same way pushing the envelope in conflict has that meaning. And there's a tendency to once you've experienced that, to keep trying to look over the edge. Okay, well, I got away with that. Now, can I go a little further and peer over the edge a little further? Am I going to see anything else? And what I found was there was nothing else to see. It was just the same view from a different perspective. But the lessons were the same.
Same view from a different perspective. It's like being on a baseball field, right? Sometimes we are the main players and we have our own line of view and we think that's the only view. But then if you trickle up and you get to the very, very tippy top of the last stand, all of a sudden you have this aerial view of different perspectives that you didn't know existed. It didn't mean they weren't there. You just didn't have that perspective at the time. And I think when we can shift our perspective on different things, we start to understand more. I also want to give you some flowers, right? You're the first American to do it, correct?
To do the an 8,000 meter peak in winter. I was the first American to climb one of the highest peaks in winter, which was Gasherbrum 2 in Pakistan. Yeah.
That's still absolutely astounding. I personally don't understand how people could survive that, but I think it's amazing what we can do to push the human body. And I think that's just such an amazing accomplishment to have. And then we have the infamous selfie that got you on the cover of National Geographic. You were told no a lot in your life, right? Because this wasn't your first time taking a picture. This wasn't your first time as a photographer. And you were told no so many times. You didn't quit. You didn't quit going up the mountain. You didn't quit any time in your life. So what keeps you going? Because you could have quit so many times in your life, but the resiliency kept you moving. Why?
Well, I think because it's such a good question. And honestly, I'm not sure I have a clear answer. I've thought so much about resilience and I speak about resilience. And I try to articulate what it boils down to. And honestly, I've never found a way to define the recipe of resilience, because so many of us have different ways that we cultivate it and foster it. For me, I think for a long time, there was a level of the need to prove that I mattered. And climbing mountains and taking pictures and having my name printed or whatever it was, or being on a stage in front of people, was this proof that I existed. And the fundamental need, as we talked about, to feel heard and validated in our existence. And I think there are inflection points throughout life where we're offered an opportunity. Well, we're offered a multitude of choices, And after getting beat down enough, it's easy to make the choice to quit, because the pain and the effort that's required to keep going is so monumental that we just can't imagine it. And yet, most of us continue on. And we continue on in some ways beautifully, even if we're deeply hurt. That is fundamental resilience. The choice to keep breathing is our base resilience. The choice to keep fighting for our survival is the basis of it. And from there, it amplifies. And I think oftentimes our need to succeed can be equal to the deficit we feel internally. But I believe when that deficit is cared for and reimagined and let go of, we can actually achieve more, because we have we freed up the psychic energy to allow us to be more creative, to expand ourselves. And then from there, the resilience shifts into creating, which is what I believe is our fundamental calling on this planet, is to create. And we are constantly creating. We are creating environments around us. We think of creativity or creating as making art, making a business, but we're always creating. And that is a very powerful realization to step into, is that our part of our base, as much as it is survival, is creativity. It's not just art. And that drive to create, to survive and then create, is the expression of our resilience.
Do you think that some people are just kind of a little bit more driven and resilient, though? Because I hear what you're saying, and we all kind of had this innate resiliency in us. I was in the Marine Corps, and I look back at when I was in the Marines, and, there was a lot of people that just couldn't make it. Especially, we had, very small amount of women who were in the Marines when I went in 2006. And we had one battalion out of the whole Marine Corps that we did boot camp for with women. And only about 3% even made it through that. And I remember looking back at the resiliency of the ones who did make it through. Even I look at myself now and I'm like, ooh, I don't know if I could do that now. But back then there was just something in me that even when my body wanted to quit, my mind just said, take one more step, keep going, because the cost of not making it feels too big. It feels too shaming. So do you feel like there are just some people who just have a little bit more drive for whatever reason, for trauma, for instinct, for their spiritual essence? I don't know. I can't explain it. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, I think you just nailed it. I think part of it is ineffable. I think part of it is inexplicable. I don't know if that, I don't know. I want to believe that, and I think it's a lovely flowery thing to say, that we all have the capacity to succeed. And that's a complicated word, but succeed and overcome. I want to believe that that's in all of us. I do also observe, just anecdotally in the world, that some people are just more inclined to persevere. But the thing that I think gets interesting there is, we don't know everybody's story, and we don't know what they're coming to the table with. So on one hand, I think it's too reductive to say some people are just more of that way. And on another level, I think, maybe yes. I mean, there's a sort of a parable or a story that I heard about about this very abusive father, and he he's a terrible alcoholic, and he abuses his two sons, and later in life one of his sons has become a terrible abusive alcoholic, and one of them has become the best father, deeply engaged with cultivating a healthy environment for his children. And they're asked, why are you the way you are? And they both answer exactly the same. They say, well, look at how I was raised. How could I not be? And,
So true.
So I just don't know. I want to believe in everybody. I want to have
Same.
that, and at the same time, it's complicated.
I agree. My trauma is my resiliency. My hyper independence is because of my trauma, 100%. And that's not even talking about like epigenetics or something that could be like literally stored in our DNA that helps us survive a little bit more because our grandmother was in a war or something.
Right.
When we talk about the right now, the person I'm looking at, how are you right now?
Man, before we started recording, I was telling you 2 days ago, I do a lot of men's work now. And part of my resiliency now is the community that I have and the ability to engage with men specifically, which makes me much healthier for women in my life. I've found the community that I've created so profoundly impactful, and I'm so grateful. And 2 nights ago, sorry.
You don't have to apologize.
Yeah, I don't know why I apologize when I cry, but 2 nights ago, 9 of these men that I've spent countless hours around the fire with and sharing and cultivating deep intimacy with and learning and growing with, 9 of them lost their homes in the Palisades fire. And so how am I doing today? I don't know. I hurt a lot for them. And I don't want to make it about me either. I just ache for their pain and their confusion and what they're going through. So today, look, I'm alive. What a glass. And I hurt. And that's part of what fills the glass, and it's part of what makes things so profoundly beautiful and also so heartbreaking. And overall in my life right now, I'll just be real with you. I stepped away from my careers, or these 2 careers that were so powerful and big. And I wrote these books. And I think as much as I tried, I had an expectation that they do something different than they have. And so financially, there's stress. I'm in a deeply loving, beautiful relationship with a powerful, powerful woman who I adore, and it's hard. And we battle and we struggle because we both come with this, our huge amount of baggage. So life is challenging right now. And I believe, Rich Roll, I was talking with him, who's become a dear friend, and he said, you're just in the forge. And I believe that. And it's hot in the forge. And, not to play on the tragedy that's just happened. But the reality is I'm whole. And that is, I think, the most meaningful thing. So to say I'm good, like, oh, I'm great. Well, that would be dishonest. But I'm whole. And there is a sense of completeness and contentment that comes with that. Money will come, relationships will ebb and flow, fires will destroy homes. But because I'm whole, I know that all of this will change shape. And that's beautiful.
And then we rebuild, right?
We rebuild.
We rebuild, and that's the resiliency of being human. Thank you so much for not being for being vulnerable and not just saying I'm good, because I
Yeah.
think that people have a tendency to just smile and say I'm okay and things are great, but inside it's really not. And I think that there's a lot of power in vulnerability. There's a lot of power in being able to say I'm not okay, actually. And we were talking before we started recording, and I feel your pain. I know exactly how that feels to have this survivor's guilt of feeling helpless. Like I want to be able to do something. I shouldn't feel this pain because the pain that they're feeling is so much bigger than mine. But part of being human is being able to be empathic and being able to sit in the trench with your friends, to be able to sit in the trench with the people who are also experiencing that pain with you. And then we rebuild and we move forward. And that's how we grow. So thank you for sharing that. I think that it's there's beauty in the tragedy in a weird way, right?
There always is. That's the polarity, and it's so hard to understand. It's the totality of things that makes it so profound and special.
Mm. When you die eventually, what do you want people to remember about you and your legacy?
Hmm. One of the exercises we do in my men's group, every cohort, we work with each other for about a year, bringing new people. One of the last exercises we do is we all write our own eulogy. And we can pick whoever we want to be the perspective that it's written from. Some people pick their children, and one guy picked God, his belief of God. And, you could choose a tree. But so I've thought about this, and really what I want more than anything is for people to remember me as somebody who worked hard to see them in their wholeness and invite them into their own understanding of it, and take the burden of isolation off their shoulders. I want people to just remember me as somebody who loved as much and as hard as I could, and gave back and learned to give back and learned, you mentioned empathy, learned to be empathetic, because that did not come naturally to me. I was too self-involved. I knew the word, I knew what it meant, but I never really felt it until pretty recently. I hear this all the time too. I hear people say, I'm such an empath. And then they're like, I can't be around that because I'm such an empath. And I always sort of chuckle to myself, because I'm like, well, that's not empathy. That's just sensitivity, and that's okay. That's okay. But actually disengaging because the energy or the situation is too much is the rejection of empathy. And, and that can be okay. Having to walk away from a situation because you're sensitive to it is just fine. But it's not empathy. Empathy, to me, what I've learned and the way I practice it, is a willful engagement with the discomfort of the feelings that other people are feeling. And in that moment, that invites them into their own, it invites them to be okay for a second. And that requires me dredging up consciously a situation where I have felt what they're feeling, so that I can relate. And in that moment, empathy becomes compassion. It's such a fascinating word, and the way we use it these days is so, I think we throw it around a little. We're a little laissez-faire about it. It's empathy to me is a conscious act. I want to be remembered as empathetic, truly empathetic and compassionate.
Thank you for telling your story, for being willing to hold space for people, to be even willing to hold space for yourself. I think that there's a lot of power in vulnerability, and it takes a lot of courage to be vulnerable. It's not easy.
Yeah.
Yes, there's validation and there's things that happen with being in the space that we're in, but telling your most deepest, darkest, shameful, even amazing experiences are very, very difficult. And it takes a lot of courage to do it. And I think you're opening a lot of doors for people to face their traumas, to face their own experiences, and to face the growth that maybe they've been afraid to take that first step for. This was a very enlightening conversation for me. And I don't say this lightly, probably one of my favorite interviews. And I've done a lot of them. You have a poetry with the way that you're able to storytell. And that's not something that I see all the time. So thank you for continuing to do the work that you do. And even though one chapter for you may have transitioned and changed, that opens up new chapters that maybe this is where you're meant to be. Maybe the climbing was one chapter for you, and maybe now you're meant to help others in a different type of way. And, be open to what that looks like, because that chapter can grow into a completely new journey. And I'm excited to see where that goes for you. And thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. It was such a pleasure. Truly just a lovely conversation. You're so insightful, and it's so great to be asked meaningful questions. I appreciate it.
Likewise.